The Swan River colony began its existence as an avowed free colony in 1829. Captain James Stirling, a man of initiative, vision and energy, had proposed the venture earlier in 1827 after a brief exploration of the Swan River region. He reported to his superiors the agricultural potential of the region, also pointing out that a settlement would serve as a bulwark against possible French expansion in the region. Stirling was subsequently appointed Lieutenant Governor of the new colony, and the first group of settlers arrived off Fremantle aboard the Parmelia early in June 1829. Within a short time, however, many of them were experiencing extreme difficulties. Many enterprises quite quickly began to fail. Part of the responsibility for the difficulties encountered could be attributed to Captain Stirling. His glowing 1827 report to Governor Darling in New South Wales, who in turn recommended it to the government in England, proved superficial and did not sufficiently countenance the contrasting conditions within a very different, often hostile landscape away from the rich soils of the immediate Swan River floodplain. And so, with their enterprises failing, many of the settlers had to survive in unaccustomed, stringent circumstances, or they left the colony. A diary of the conditions encountered was kept by Dr. Samuel Vivish, who, along with his brother, workers and their families, had arrived at the Swan River in 1839 and shortly after purchased Yangeddine, a property of 11,000 acres, around halfway between York and Beverley. Like many others, Vivish brought with him from the old country a strongly ingrained, intensive mixed farming mentality, that is, horse, sheep, cattle, pig and poultry husbandry. They also brought a wide array of seeds for crops, vegetable and fruit produce, unsuited to the strange new agricultural environment, to the very different landscape and soils. The diary records the wide array of problems he faced on the property over the next 2 years. He wrote of the lack of fencing in the days before wire to contain stock, necessitating skilled shepherds, many of whom soon left for less demanding environments or began to demand higher wages. Of the critical lack of water for his animals. Of the lack of infrastructure development, few roads and bridges which would facilitate the essential flow of commerce. Of the wide array of poison plants and the stock diseases encountered, resulting in considerable stock losses. Of bushfires and dust and flies. Of personal health problems such as the constant debilitation of colonial ophthalmia, more commonly called sandy blight, which brought on temporary blindness. Of extreme shortages of many basic items, such as tools and equipment which, should they break or become inoperable, were either overly expensive to replace or unprocurable. The local white ants found the English timber handles of the picks and shovels, for example, much to their liking. Defeated by the difficulties, Vivish left the property after only 2 years and took up a government post as a resident magistrate at Guildford. Today, the nearby suburb of Vivish is named after him. His early catalogue of despair at the Yangeddine property portrays the conditions under which most early farming enterprises in the foundling colony were operating. Many of the men on the Governor's Advisory Council, though holding government positions, such as the Surveyor General John Septimus Roe, were also landholders. Their enterprises too had suffered from a lack of essential labour. In 1848 they were instrumental in persuading Governor Fitzgerald to petition the British government for a trial complement of convicts to be sent to the Swan River in an attempt to ease the situation where many enterprises within the colony seemed on the point of disintegration. It was a highly controversial initiative, but many felt there was little choice. The upshot of these negotiations was that the Swan River Colony, founded as a free settlement, celebrated its 21st birthday with the arrival of the first boatload of 75 convicts off Fremantle aboard the transport Scindian on the 1st of June 1850. The British government agreed, however, that the convicts should be short-term offenders, under the age of 45 years and in good health, have good conduct records, have already served around half their sentence, and were thought to be capable of rehabilitation. In the first 4 years of the convict system in Western Australia, the insertion of these men into the colonial society went relatively smoothly. The statistical graphic here, however, shows a dramatic change from 1854 onward. The type of convict arriving changed, and the potential for compromising the good order of the quiet, peaceful society rose appreciably. Aboard the first 7 transports, containing around 2,000 convicts in all, the rate of violent crime convictions ran at around 4%. Thereafter, as you can see, it rose alarmingly. Nevertheless, surprisingly, the convicts, despite the bad records of many on these ships, did not cause the trouble some expected. Their behaviour after arrival in the colony proved to be, overall, very good, in fact quite remarkably so. The very different landscape, better living conditions, comparative freedoms, and new opportunities saw many convicts, as statistics attest, begin to transition their lives in more positive directions to become hard-working, law-abiding citizens. These figures display some basic points about the effects on the colony of the insertion of an alien, unwanted body of men who had left their home country, often unwillingly, for the good of another community on the far side of the world. The population of the state rose by nearly 5 times during the convict era. The British government had been true to its word, in this instance at least. It had sent out a comparable number of free settlers to convicts between 1850 and 1868. By the early 1870s, when there were still over 3,000 convicts under government control in Western Australia, exports had risen to around 15 times what they had been in the early 1850s. The severe labour shortages within the struggling colony meant that the convicts were treated relatively well by the free colonists. It was, after all, in their interests to do so. It is very possible this a contributing factor toward a closing of the social gap, a far cry from the divisions within British society. This, one of the major provenances of our relative egalitaire or social equality within modern Australian society today. What eventually happened to the 9,500 convicts who came to Western Australia between June 1850 and January 1868? The life expectancy of a male who'd been born in the 1820s, the 30s or 40s in Britain was 39.2 years. In contrast, statistics affirm that the convicts born in Britain during that time, but who had come to the Swan River Colony, lived on average to the age of 58.2 years. That is, they lived 19 years longer in the new environment. Though 27% of the convict arrivals were recorded as having been married or widowed before departure from Britain, very few family reunions subsequently took place in the colony. Some sources indicate less than 5%. In time, pockets of former convicts such as these 3 did exist in smaller communities throughout the state, living a subsistence existence, then dying out gradually in towns like York or Toodyay or Northam, or at the Knoll in Fremantle, or at the Old People's Home below Mount Eliza near the Swan Brewery, the former convict hiring depot that served the Perth labour market during the convict transportation era. And so it remains today, apart from a vestige or residue of those former times of economic desperation and then gradual recovery. We still have remaining a variety of buildings that remind us of that time. The convict-built Perth Town Hall, Fremantle Prison, Government House, the Barracks Arch, and other lesser-known buildings such as the York Roman Catholic Church, which was built by Irish Fenian convict Joseph Noonan. There are 4 state premiers and a deputy premier who are convict descendants, as well as many other prominent citizens, such as former captain of an All-Australian AFL side. And every year on WA Day, descendants of convicts and pensioner guards are presented with authenticated certificates within the walls of Fremantle Jail. With the gold rush to centres such as Coolgardie and Kalgoorlie in the 1890s, bringing with it a burgeoning of the state's population from New South Wales and Victoria in the main, the population grew over threefold, and society in Western Australia was transformed by the influx. The earlier times of struggle and division rapidly faded, and many within the new society, knowing little of those former years, paid little heed to what had gone before. During this 1890s period, discussions and conventions had taken place between the states, proposing that all of them should join together to form one united country, Australia. But Western Australia remained divided in opinion. Premier John Forrest was caught between the new unruly pro-Federation goldfield areas, where many had recently come from the eastern states, and his own political supporters in Perth, together with those within the established agricultural districts, both opposed to Federation. Eventually he persuaded Parliament to allow a referendum. It proved to be the goldfields populations which generated a decisive majority in favour of Western Australia joining the promulgation of the Commonwealth of Australia on the 1st of January 1901. And so only at the last stages of the national movement for the Federation of the Australian States did Western Australia agree to join and become an integral member of the new Commonwealth of Australia, the celebrations taking place at Centennial Park in Sydney, with the first Governor-General Lord Hopetoun representing Queen Victoria in front of 60,000 people. 5 months later, the first Parliament was opened in Melbourne. The first Prime Minister was Edmund Barton. John Forrest, formerly Western Australia's first Premier, and now representing the Swan electorate in the National Parliament, was present as Australia's first Postmaster General. Then later, Minister for Defence, Minister for Home Affairs, Treasurer, and also acting Prime Minister in 1907. Here in outline are probably the most notable areas for investigation or discussion within Western Australia's formative years, between the founding of the colony in 1829 and the state's entry into the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901. Firstly, James Stirling's initiative and energies were vital to the founding of the state, but his misjudgments caused considerable problems for several decades to come. Secondly, what were the factors involved in the rapid decline of the early colony in the first 20 years, to the point of despair and disintegration for many? It would be interesting to then look at the considerable controversy surrounding the advent of convict transportation into the free Labour Swan River colony. Why was it so contentious? Examine why the economic benefits of convict transportation were so profound, but also think of its contribution to social equality within the infant colony, and then its longer-term contribution to the social equality we enjoy today. But there were compromising political and social aspects of having a proportionally high number of ex-convicts within the state, after the convict transportation era ended, particularly with the old established conservative elements mounting strong opposition to the new radical movements rising up within the colony. Quite suddenly then, the 1890s gold rushes occurred. What were the consequences and benefits for the Cinderella state? And finally, surprisingly, there was strong opposition to Western Australia joining the Commonwealth of Australia from some quarters. What were the arguments for and against? These founding decades in earlier Western Australia were important in establishing the foundations for the lifestyles and many of the cultural characteristics in our modern community today. So enjoy your discussion and reflections on this crucial, diverse and interesting era in our colonial history.